gaming historians, and welcome to Lord of Lore, where we break down the lore and history of our favorite games and fantasies. The last time we visited Amalur's lore, we explored its deep history and what events led to the Crystal War and the events of the game Reckoning. Today, however, we're going to discuss the events that happen after the game. As you may have guessed, this history is not explored in any of the game's content, although there are some books and lore stones that hint at some of the events and future dangers. To find out what happens after the game, we're going to dive into extended sources found both in the wiki and the cancelled MMO, Project Copernicus. Now fair warning, there are some spoilers ahead. Let's discuss. As those of you may know, the main game of Reckoning takes place during the Crystal War during the Age of Arcana, when the powerful Fae Tirnoch not only drives the Winter Fae to wage war on the mortals, but also disturbs the very forces of magic and fate with their presence, particularly in the power of Prismeer, a crystallization of her essence. Eventually, Tirnoch is defeated by the Fateless One and the kingdoms of Amalur were freed from fate, or at least the destinies that have been created by Tirnoch. However, what does this mean for the rest of Amalur? The Crystal War had disastrous effects on the Fae, who suffered not only from the war and seclusion, but also the defeat of Tirnoch and the disappearance of Fate. As a result, nearly all of the Fae went mad or went into hiding. The mortals, however, experienced a time of brief peace. Tirnoch's magical prison of Amaranthinez, now free of her malice and filled with powerful Prismeer, was immediately explored and settled by the ambitious Daklfar, who sought to master its secrets to increase their magical power. However, this era of peace soon came to a crashing halt when the Age of Arcana transitioned to the Age of Ruin. For unknown reasons, though it is hinted to be a result of the madness of the Fae, the world was bombarded with frequent wars, plagues, and destruction of settlements. The gnomish city of Idylla was destroyed, erasing half the world's history, literature, and artifacts. The Daklfar capital of Rathir was destroyed, the dark elves of the plains of Erethael fleeing to the caverns of Amaranthinez. The Leosulfar, once the greatest administrators of magic and justice, were forced to seclude themselves in Glen Suthane. Even the Almain were threatened with extinction, their lands, especially Eldrith, besieged from all sides by giants and monsters. During the Age of Ruin, the kingdoms of Amalur looked destined for destruction. And that's when the Colossi emerged during the Age of Enlightenment. Having experienced a cultural revolution thanks to the efforts of Athene and the Fateless One, the Colossi has prospered and grown both in knowledge and in power. Deciding to spread their culture and protection to other lands, the Colossi raised an army and marched to Eldrith to save the Almain. Inspired by this beacon of hope, the Leosulfar and the halfling race Masariol marched alongside the Colossi to join them in their holy war. Together, the kingdom saved Eldrith and drove out the monsters, forming an alliance known as the Concordance. Under the leadership of the Colossi, the Concordance drove out many invaders, spread education, and re-established trade routes and alliances. Under the Hyperion Age, the kingdoms of the Concordance enjoyed times of peace and growth, particularly the powerful Colossi. The Leosulfar, once the dominant power of justice and political alliances, were content to remain within Glen Suthane to study magic, gifting the Masariol with Tirna Noth, which the Masariol would establish as Vino Terra. The Daklfar, meanwhile, continued their experiments with Prismeer in magical experiments that changed their politics and their appearance, and some said it even affected their minds. As the Colossi continued to grow, the savage Tirgash began to raid cities not under the protection of the Concordance. When the kingdoms began to reach out to the Colossi for protection, the Colossi declared that they would only lend aid to kingdoms that joined the Concordance and obeyed their laws. This led to the Colossi Empire growing in strength, land, wealth, and as a result, decadence. In addition, their growth began to threaten the dominance of the Daklfar, who feared that they would have to surrender their freedom and secrets to the Imperial Colossi. Future Colossi emperors began to lapse in wisdom and virtue, and the Colossi faced their first major problem when their floating city of Idylla began to run out of magic. Then the Daklfar approached the Colossi and offered them large amounts of Prismeer to keep Idylla aloft. The Colossi soon entered a close alliance with the Daklfar, but unbeknownst to them, Daklfar agents were secretly planning the Colossi's downfall. The Jotun, feeling left out of the Colossi's empire and persecuted by their ancestors, were easy prey for the manipulation of the Daklfar, who convinced the Jotun that the Colossi were their enemies. Eventually, the Daklfar queen entered an affair with the Colossi emperor. In his bed, the queen seduced the emperor into banishing the Jotun from Colossi lands. The emperor did just as he was told, and the angered Jotun fled to the Doclafar and joined forces. Ready to launch their attack, the Doclafar sorcerers used their powers to completely drain the prismere that kept Idylla afloat. When the city crashed into the earth, countless Colossi were killed, and the Doclafar released the Jotun to finish off the rest. Thankfully for the Colossi, the Losafar led their Almain and Masarial allies to the Colosse's defense, saving many of the survivors. However, the damage was done. The Colossi Empire had been weakened, and the Doclafar had succeeded in creating their own alliance, the Amaranthinez, the sworn enemy of the Concordance. As these two forces came into conflict, the gnomes desperately sought to make peace between the two factions to prevent a massive world war, but their efforts were crippled by another flux of magic, an event that became known as the Age of Heroes. When dark forces began stirring in the corners of the world, magic began to shift and change once again, gifting many heroes with new magical powers and physical feats none thought possible. Despite the good these abilities offered, the two factions used these powers not for peace, but for war. Filled with centuries of betrayal and hatred, the races of the Concordance and the Amaranthinez started a massive war that would change Amalur forever. It will be a war of legends, a war of epic proportions, a war that will change the very fabric of